So, okay, here's the thing. I want to talk to you this morning about mistakes. I want to talk to you about some mistakes that I have made in code and in life. And I want to talk to you about some of the things that I'm learning from that experience. So, a few years ago, I went through a period where I lost my dreams and I lost my faith. I know, real bummer for a conference opener. Sorry. It gets better. But let's talk about dreams. So I'm one of those people that from a pretty young age, I had a strong image in mind of the right lifestyle for me to have. I had been sort of taught, like, this is the life that I should aspire to. And so from the age of, by the way, sorry, that's JavaScript, I apologize. But from the age of about 18 onwards, I set myself single-mindedly to achieving that lifestyle. And I just started kind of ticking my way down a series of boxes towards that lifestyle, getting a software job, leveling up my software career by moving from one employer to the next, and by raising my profile with blogging, with podcasting, with speaking, and other things like getting married, having kids, all these things going towards this image I had of the perfect life. And I was very single-minded in this. Along the way, other things like hobbies and friendships kind of fell by the wayside. And by the age of 35, I had achieved the lifestyle that I'd set out to get to. I was living in a big house in the woods, in the mountains of eastern Tennessee. I had a bunch of kids. My family was all around me because I was working from home. I was running my own business. So I had the freedom and the flexibility that I wanted. I had arrived. I was done. And I got to enjoy this state of affairs for about 2 years. And then a surprise occurred. My relationship unexpectedly fell apart. And I found myself, in the aftermath of that, sitting alone in that big house in the woods and kind of reconsidering everything that had brought me to that point. And what I realized is, have any of you seen the Lego Movie? I mean, even if you haven't, you at least probably played with Legos as a kid, and you all knew that one kid that would build the models, just get them just so, and then leave them there and never take them apart, just fixed in place. And that's the plot of the Lego Movie. And I realized I had become that kid. I was trying to get everything just so to get my life into a perfect state and then freeze it into place forever with crazy glue. In a way, I had been trying all this time to bring my life to an end. Not an end in death, but to a fixed, static state. By the way, can I get a glass of water up here? I was trying to achieve a return value, a successful return. Now, around the same time, I was also in the process of losing my faith. And by faith, I of course mean, thank you. I of course mean my faith in the dominant religion of our times, object-oriented programming. See, I had spent my entire career learning about and practicing object-oriented programming. And then later in that career, I wound up having to unlearn most of that, because it turns out most of what I had learned about object-oriented programming was wrong. But who even gets to say what is right and wrong in something like OO? Well, if anyone can, It might be this guy. Who here knows who this is? Exactly, the small talk guy. This is Alan Kay. Alan Kay and his team is the man who is responsible for coining the term object-oriented programming and inventing the philosophy of object-oriented programming. Other people, he built on concepts that other people had created, but as far as a coherent programming philosophy, he's the guy who came up with it. And he and his team at Xerox PARC created the Smalltalk language to kind of embody the idea of OO. And then everything, all the languages that we have since, particularly Ruby, come out of Smalltalk. So when someone asked him to boil down what does OO mean, he said this. He said, OO to me means only messaging, local retention and protection and hiding of state process, and extreme late binding of all things. And he went on to say that of those three elements, to him, messaging was the most important idea. And he even regretted calling it object-oriented programming because he felt like it missed the big point. So once I learned this, once I understood this, I set about trying to just practice and teach OO strictly in terms of this simple idea of messaging. But something never felt quite right. Because I started looking at messaging in OO languages like Ruby versus actually sending a message. So let's compare these, okay? So like sending a message in the mail versus what we call sending a message in a language like Ruby. When you send a message in the mail, you sum up just the things that the recipient needs to know in order to act on that message. And that's the information that you send. Whereas when we send a message in an OO language, what do? We pass an object, we pass a reference to an object. And it has references to other objects, and the recipient can reach back through those references and get to all kinds of other information. When I send a message in the mail and the recipient doesn't understand it, or they just never receive it, they can't be found, what happens to me? Nothing. Nothing happens to the sender. But in OO language, what happens to the sender? Exception. Everything blows up on the sender's side. And most importantly, when I send a letter in the mail, I don't have to freeze at the mailbox waiting for the recipient to acknowledge it. But that is exactly what happens in our OO languages when we send a message. And I steadily became more and more aware of this kind of cognitive dissonance. You know, a lot of people will tell you that the original sin of object-oriented programming was including mutable state. I disagree. I believe that the original sin of object-oriented programming was retaining return values from the procedural languages that came before, because return values are a fundamental denial of the messaging model. And when you look at some of the stuff that Alan Kay wrote, he kind of agrees. Like he says, looking back at the history of Smalltalk, he says that, you know, they had a vision, but they never quite got there. And as a matter of fact, later versions of Smalltalk kind of backslid a bit towards its procedural roots. And all of the OO languages that we use today, including Ruby, JavaScript, everything, they're all inheriting from those later versions of Smalltalk. And what I realized is that this is the big lie of object-oriented programming for the last 40 years. We keep saying that we're sending messages, but we're really not. It's really the same call and return semantics inherited from the procedural predecessors. So I lost my dreams in a goal-driven life, and I had lost my faith in object-oriented programming. And these may seem like completely separate things, but as I was reflecting on these together, I realized that they actually had something in common. Because they actually both come from the same worldview. They both stem from viewing the world in terms of goal-obsessed, uninterrupted blocking procedures fixated on success. And another term for this is a transaction. A transaction is a thing that is synchronous and blocking. It either completes or it self-destructs. It has no visible internal state. It's supposed to be this black box. It has a goal. It's synonymous with its goal. It doesn't exist outside of the goal. It has no identity. It has no persistent state or history. It's independent and self-contained. And what I've realized is humans in general, and programmers in particular, are prone to a fallacy where we look at a process in the world and then we try to model it as a transaction. And so I've come to refer to this as the transactional fallacy. And the transactional fallacy is everywhere in software. You know, when you've got a procedure that's supposed to process data and you dump a whole bunch of data on it and it just freezes up the whole system, and you realize that just to create a progress bar would involve some significant rewriting. That's the transactional fallacy. Let's say you've got a system that's composed of a bunch of stateless service objects. This is an architecture that's become popular lately. And you've got a workflow that used to consist of a single request that used a single one of those service objects, but it has grown to encompass multiple requests, each one hitting a different service object. And you find yourself looking for ways to sneak little bundles of intermediate state from one request to the next. This is a result of the transactional fallacy. You see this all the time in forms. Forms are a way that we try to squeeze human communication into the transactional mold. But communication is a process, and so we find ourselves doing things like, oh, we have to rewrite because we need multiple pages in our form. And then we realize that people are filling out a few of the pages, and then they have to go pick up their kids from school, and then they come back, and the pages have cleared themselves out in the meantime. And they're mad at us now, and so then we have to rewrite the code again to support saving the form in an intermediate state, maybe often browser storage or something. But then we realize that, oh, actually, we need to be able to query on the incomplete form data. And so we have to rewrite again to put that data into the database. This all flows from the transactional fallacy, modeling something that is a process as if it's a single transaction. Whenever I take my kids to a new doctor, I have to spend 15 minutes filling out intake forms. I don't know if this is a problem you have in South Africa, but it's a huge problem in the States. And it's super annoying, but at least I know that if I put that clipboard down for a second, it won't reset itself. At least I know I can take that clipboard with me to the examination room while my kid's getting checked out, and I can fill it out, asynchronously. I shudder to think what the intake process would look like if it were designed by a programmer. Now, the transactional fallacy has a symbol, and it's a symbol that you're probably already familiar with, even if you don't realize it. The symbol of the transactional fallacy is the spinning beach ball of doom. This is the universal symbol that a programmer thought something was going to either finish or fail, one of those two things, more or less instantaneously, and it did neither of those things. So, is there an alternative to the transactional fallacy? Well, let's turn back to Alan Kay for a second. When he was describing his ideal of OO, he said he thought of objects being like biological cells or computers on a network, only able to communicate with messages. Now, does this sound like a transactional system? No, it sounds like something much more independent and asynchronous. And as a matter of fact, when you look at some of the history of Smalltalk, like some of the early versions, you see glimmers of a very different system. This is a snippet of some Smalltalk 72 code. This class is also a function. It is a function over a stream of messages, and it's pattern matching on those messages, and then deciding what to do based on what it pattern matches. Now, this might look a little bit familiar to some of you. Anyone? Yeah, see some nods? Yeah, because if you squint, it looks a little bit like Erlang or Elixir code for an actor, pattern matching on incoming messages. And this is not a coincidence. There was a lot of interplay between the Smalltalk and the actor model community. But you know, what I've realized is that when Alan Kay was talking about this stuff, he was talking about objects as if they were processes. As you may know, if you work with Erlang or Elixir, it's built on what? It's built on processes. And I've realized message-orienting, the message-oriented model implies process-oriented. And the more you look at the things that we model, the more you realize that so much of what we model in software are actually processes. And then we arbitrarily slice them up across object boundaries, and we wonder why our systems are so hard to understand. What if we stopped focusing so much on the structure, the static structure, and the entities in our systems, and started looking for the processes, looking for the stories that are told through our code? This is the space that I've started to explore. And one of the first things that I realized is that the word process is problematic because it's already really overloaded. We use process to mean a lot of things in software, some of them very concrete. And so as a result, I've decided to stop using the word process so much, and I've started using the word narrative. And so for the rest of this talk, I'm going to use the word narrative. And I like this word because it's about finding the stories and modeling the stories. And the more you look at the world, the more you realize it's narratives everywhere. Your software project that you're working on right now is a narrative. Your team is a narrative. Your own cells are constantly dying and replacing themselves, and yet you have a coherent identity. It's not so much that you are a person as that you're constantly personing. You are a living narrative. And your life is a narrative, and there's no return value to it. There's no successful return. There's no finish line, which means there's no success criteria. And the thing is, I have a belief that the way we design software is unconsciously influenced by the way we think about the world. And I believe it goes the other way as well. I believe that the way we perceive the world is unconsciously influenced by how we model things in code. Because you can't do something for 8 hours a day without it bleeding over into how you think about the world. And the thing is, transactional thinking, it leads to brittle lives, and it leads to brittle code. And what I've realized is that this is fundamentally a philosophical problem. You ever heard the story of Theseus Ship? Theseus goes out on voyages and has many adventures, and over the course of the adventures, he has to, his ship is damaged. He has to, replace the mast and the sails, and then later he has to replace the deck, and then later he has to replace the hull. And by the time he finally gets home, no part of the ship is the same as the parts that started out. So is it the same ship, or is it a new ship? And this is the question that the substance versus the process philosophers argue about. And Kelso Vieira had this great article in Aeon where he kind of summed this up. He says, we often see the world as a world of things. Objects are the paradigmatic mode of existence, the basic building blocks of the universe. But process philosophers think we should instead examine the processes that make up the world. Processes, not objects, are fundamental. I really believe that programming is applied philosophy. We use code as a way to reflect our understanding of the world. So we can't partition these two parts of our lives. And I think the best place to start thinking in narratives may actually be in how we approach our lives. And so with that in mind, for the rest of this talk, I want to talk about some of the properties of narrative thinking. But I'm going to talk about them mostly in terms of how I am learning to live my life now. And maybe along the way we'll have a few little applications to code. So first off, a narrative has a direction rather than a goal. As I have started moving away from a goal-oriented life, I've started asking myself, how do I decide what to do? And what I've realized is that it's useful to have certain images in mind, certain pole stars that I can kind of pull towards without them being a place that I necessarily expect to arrive. My friend Artie Starr calls this having an arrow. An example of an arrow is my beer list. Now, this is not a list of beers. It's a list of notable people that I would love to have a beer with someday. It will probably not surprise you at this point to know that Alan Kay is on that list. But some of my others are a little bit less obvious. It would be really cool to meet the poet Rupi Kaur someday. That would be remarkable. Or I'd love to sit down and talk with the dancer Marquise Scott, otherwise known as Nonstop. But here's the thing about the beer list. This is not about, I hope I get to meet them at a book signing or I run across them in an airport or something someday. It's about asking myself, what would my life look like for me to just organically find myself having a beer with one of these people? What kind of changes would have happened in my life to bring me to that point? What kind of work would I be doing in the world for it to be natural for me to have a beer with Nonstop? It's kind of a heuristic, and it's also kind of a way of breaking out of my bubble of what I imagine my life can be. I don't know that I'll actually have a beer with most of the people on that list, ever. But it gives me a heuristic for what direction to go in without having a goal. What might it look like to model direction over code over goals in code? Well, like we were talking about, one way to do that might be embracing the actor model, either in language or just in the way we build our systems. Could mean recognizing that it is not enough to have a finished value. All or nothing isn't a good enough approach. We often need feedback before we get there. And so embracing batching and streaming models. If you want to learn more about the actor model, a great way to start is by learning Elixir, because that's very Ruby influenced. Now, having a direction implies that a narrative is constantly becoming. And becoming requires being aware of where I am and how I am right now. It requires a sense of self. And it turns out there is a perfect teacher for learning about being aware of yourself. And that teacher is always accessible to you because that teacher is your own body. Your body is never static. It's constantly changing, and it has no ideal end state. And your body will interrupt you in the middle of trying to close some transaction with little reminders of the narrative of life, like, I'm hungry, I'm cold, I'm tired. You know, as programmers, I think that we often try to be brains in jars. We get the idea that we can completely separate our ideas from our bodies. But part of learning to embrace narrative as a person means acknowledging that you are an embodied mammal. It means learning to live in your body. And that might mean something as simple as picking up a meditation practice or doing yoga or running or hiking or cycling or something like that. But these are all great ways of putting yourself in touch with your body. But be careful. Be careful when you're doing these things. Because we get so addicted to being brains in jars that even in the midst of physical activity, we find ways of pulling ourselves out of presence with our own bodies, and getting back into our analytical brains. Because we measure and we quantify, we find numbers. And if it's not obvious what I'm saying is get rid of your Fitbit. Learn to feel when you need to take more steps. Learn to feel your target heart rate. Learn to feel when you're dehydrated. Excuse me. What might self-awareness look like applied to code? Well, it might mean architecting our systems for observability first instead of leaving it as an afterthought. It might mean writing algorithms that can tell the story of their results. If you want to learn more about observability, I highly recommend looking up, just look up everything Charity Majors has written. And she's got some great stuff on observability. So a narrative has a direction, and it's aware of itself. And knowing where you are and where you're going, it means you also know where you've been. It means, so embracing narrative means embracing state. It means embracing history. And I realize that embracing state is not always a popular suggestion in this day and age, but embracing state simply means acknowledging time. It means acknowledging that everything of worth that we want to do, that we want to accomplish with code involves the passage of time. And that every narrative, whether it's a workflow or a human being, is an accumulation of events and their lasting effects. You know, I think as programmers, we love the idea of a reset, of a clean slate. It's such a nice, simplifying model, but in the real world, we have to deal with history. We need to accept history. We have to deal with legacy and realize that there are no clean slates. What does embracing state and history look like in code? That's a big topic. I'll just give you some pointers here for some things that you might want to look into. You could look into temporal modeling, which is the idea of modeling systems first in terms of the events that occur along their timelines, rather than in terms of the static entities that are involved, and that may lead you towards an event-sourced architecture. Identifying those events, those stories. One way of doing that is to practice event storming, which is a way of getting together with your team and mapping out the storyline, the events in a system before you worry about the entities. If you want to learn more about that, Alberto Brandolini wrote the book on that one. Embracing history means embracing entropy. It means embracing failure. But with narratives, we look for ways to fail forwards because we realize that there will always be surprises. Like sometimes a scorpion just falls off the ceiling onto your monitor a foot in front of your face. Totally hypothetical example. But now in our typical OO languages, how do we usually handle a surprise such as this? We raise an exception, right? And in the process, we tear down the call stack, we tear down all of the local variables, throw away, network connections, basically anything that we might have used to diagnose what went wrong, we throw away. Something I've noticed over the course of my career is that the more energy we put into avoiding failure, the more catastrophic it is when it finally manages to sneak through. We need to be more focused. We need to be less focused on preventing failure and more on how we adapt and keep going, which means it means being okay with being not okay. It means learning to sit and work skillfully with failure and with suffering. My friend Amy Newell has been giving some talks about this. If you haven't seen one of her talks, definitely look one of those up. What does failing forwards look like in code? Well, it could mean selectively modeling some surprises as data, as outcomes rather than as exceptions. Could mean embracing the saga pattern where we predict surprises and we line up compensating actions that we can take when a surprise occurs. It could just mean spending more time planning for mitigation and remediation. What are we going to do? How are we going to handle surprises? Than we spend on trying to make everything correct. And the resilience engineering community has started a wonderful conversation in our industry about all this stuff. One of the things they'll tell you is that you cannot build resilience into code. Anybody who says you can is selling something. The only thing you can build resilience into is the socio-technical system that's around the code, the people, basically. If you want to learn more about resilience engineering, one place to start is the Stella report. If we're going to be okay in failed states, then we can't be alone. Being okay in a failed state means interdependence. When my transactional life raised an exception and fell apart, I realized something. I realized that I had a lot of people that I knew online, but locally I had no one. I had completely failed to build a local tribe. I did a poll about this once, and out of more than 1,000 people that replied, the vast majority of programmers that replied felt like their local support network is probably insufficient. And that's kind of scary. But I think it's an epidemic problem among programmers. I think a symptom of being brains in jars is, we feel is that we very easily content ourselves with online relationships because it's not a big jump from believing that you can divorce your ideas from your body to believing that typing text to somebody is just as good as going out and having a beer with them. And it is, until it's not, until you need somebody to come and sit with you. And so if you take nothing else away from this talk, I hope you take this away. I want to encourage you, if you feel like you're in that majority of that poll, I want to encourage you to prioritize making those local friendships. Do it now before some catastrophe occurs in your life. And if you're not sure how to get started, please come talk to me. I would be happy to help. Code can be interdependent as well. We have a lot of patterns for this. We have things like back pressure algorithms, back-offs, circuit breaker pattern. And all these patterns have something in common. They all involve components in the system holding state for other components in the system. They're not black boxes anymore. They're aware of the state of other components in the system. And they make allowances for that state. In other words, these are all rudimentary forms of empathy in code. Again, more pointers. If you want to learn more about these, some of those patterns, these are two great books, Reactive Design Patterns and Release It by Michael Nygaard. If you don't have these on your shelf, run out and get them. They're great. So these are some of the values that I've identified, some of the properties of narrative thinking. And when I look at these, they make me think of something specific. See, the thing is, so much of the stuff that we do in life is focused on achieving an endpoint, getting to a goal. Get that new job, finish the current project, get this test passing. Then you go home and it's get the groceries, make dinner, eat the dinner. Even when we play games, most of the time our games are focused on achieving a successful conclusion. We're trying to get to that, that win state, a return value. But there is one thing that I do on a regular basis that doesn't involve any kind of trying to get to a successful end at all. I love to go to electronic music clubs and dance. And when I'm dancing, I'm not trying to get to a return value. I'm not trying to finish. I'm not trying to succeed at dancing and be done. When I'm dancing, I'm following the lead of the music. That's my direction. When I'm dancing, I'm definitely in touch with myself, with my embodied self. My position in space is a product of all of the movements that came before. I definitely try to fail forwards. If I stumble, I try to roll with it. I try to incorporate that into the dance. And dancing is a very interdependent activity because I feel the energy of the other dancers on the floor, and they feel my energy. And sometimes I even try to dance with a partner. Now, I'm terrible at it. It's bad. One time somebody tried to dance with me. We're out there on the dance floor. We're trying to dance together, and like 30 seconds into it, they just stopped and they leaned in, and they were like, "Dude, are you okay?" It's like, "Yeah, I'm fine. I'm just bad at this." But I still do it sometimes. I still try to dance with other people sometimes. And sometimes I'll find myself dancing with another partner who, every time I stumble, and every time I screw up, every time I botch a twirl, they make space for it. And they flow into it. And they incorporate it into the dance. And as a result, they wind up making both of us look good, and both of us feel good. Dancing is all about grace, right? And what I've realized about grace is that grace is not just successfully executing a move. The truest grace is about accepting surprises and flowing into them. And when we do that, we make each other look good. We make each other feel good. In the Ruby community, we like to talk about being nice. We say, Mats is nice, and so we are nice. But for the next 2 days, I want to challenge you to take this one step further. Not just nice, but to practice grace. To look for ways to make each other look good and feel good. I don't know if you have a goal at this conference. A lot of times when I'm at a conference, I feel like I have a goal, like, I want to meet a certain number of people, or I want to get a new job opportunity, or I want to sell my product, or I want to learn a new skill. That's a big one. But I want to invite you, whatever your goals are, to let them go. There's no goal here for the next 2 days of this conference. There's no possibility of success or failure. There's just this dance that we weave together. Look around yourself. Look left, look right. No, really, do it. These are your dance partners. Okay, for the next couple of days, these are your dance partners on the floor. How can you make them look good and feel good? And I'll make just a few suggestions for this. First off, don't worry about meeting the right people or having the right conversation. I want to encourage you to accept the person in front of you as the right person to be having a conversation with right now, or the person next to you at dinner. And in starting conversations, I am very awkward with this stuff, but I want to encourage you and say, don't sweat this stuff too hard. Don't overcomplicate it. You can just say, hi, I'm Avdi. What's your name? And then, what are you thinking about lately? What are you working on? And then, this brings me to my second suggestion, which is, when I'm having one of these conference conversations, a lot of times, what I'll find myself tempted to do is, like, somebody will be telling me, what they're thinking about, what they're working on. They'll be like, blah, blah, legacy, monolith, technical debt, blah, blah, and I'll be, what I'm tempted to reply with, what I always want to reply with is like, oh, yeah, legacy, monolith, technical debt, yeah, been there, yeah, that's tough. Because I want to show that, like, I'm sympathetic, like, and validate them, right? But I also want to show that, like, I know what they're talking about. Like, oh yeah, that's old news to me. I know all about that. And and in a way, it's kind of like closing a transaction. Like, okay, that topic's done. We succeeded at that one. It doesn't keep the dance going. And so I want to encourage you, instead of going with that temptation to be like, oh yeah, yep, I know what you're talking about, to say, tell me more about that. How did that make you feel? What are you thinking about doing next? Keep that dance going. Even if you already know about that, or if you think you already know about that, still, say, tell me more about that. And finally, keep your circles open. Make space for somebody new to join your circle. Like the Pac-Man rule, keep a space open for somebody to join you. And when somebody new wanders up, invite them in. A great way to do this is to introduce them, because you've just met someone. So now you can say, hi, this is my new friend Angus. What's your name? What are you thinking about? Yeah, I just want to encourage you to give each other the grace and the space to flow. And part of that, is be awkward. Because when you are awkward, that is a kind of grace, because it gives other people space to be awkward. That is a gift that you give them. So, yeah, when you feel yourself trying to complete a transaction here, practice continuing the narrative instead. Because transactions, they either finish or they fail. And along the way, they deny other possibilities. But narratives go on and on like a graceful dance, embracing possibility. So we've graceful narratives in code and in your life. Thank you very much.